Welcome to The Explainer. So imagine a country completely overflowing with resources. We're talking millions of tons of food, warehouses literally packed to the brim with clothes, and plenty of empty houses just sitting there. But now imagine the citizens of that exact same country starving in the streets, shivering, and being evicted from their homes with absolutely nowhere to go. It's a staggering contradiction, right? I mean, what actually happens when a society produces massive surpluses, but its own people are completely locked out from getting to them? Today, we're looking at how everyday folks survive the absolute darkest days of the Great Depression, not by waiting around for a top-down rescue, but through some truly radical self-help. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the paradox of plenty, look at some faces in hard times, explore grassroots barter, check out the bootleg coal rebellion, and finally, unpack the power of disruption. Let's get right into it. Our focus today is grounded directly in Howard Zinn's text, specifically Chapter 15 of A People's History of the United States, which is titled Self-Help in Hard Times. In this explainer, we're exploring the historical reality of the 1930s exactly as Zinn presents it. We really want to understand the grassroots movements, the amazing local ingenuity, and frankly, the sheer desperation that defined the American working class during this massive economic collapse. All right, Section 1, the paradox of plenty, surpluses versus starvation. The economic landscape of the 1930s was, well, it was a stark, almost unbelievable juxtaposition. As Zinn points out, there were millions of tons of food just sitting around, but because it wasn't profitable to transport or sell it, it didn't move. Warehouses were literally full of clothing, but penniless people couldn't afford to buy a single thread of it. You had all these houses standing completely empty, but they stayed vacant because out-of-work citizens just couldn't pay rent. Zinn uses this to highlight the sheer absurdity of an economic system where distribution is based purely on profit rather than actual human need. And those folks who got evicted, they ended up living in makeshift shacks. You've probably heard the name for these makeshift shacks, Hoovervilles. The source text describes them as shacks quickly thrown together and built right on top of garbage dumps by people who had been evicted and couldn't pay rent. So to put that into perspective, you have structurally sound, empty homes on one side of town and families living on top of literal garbage dumps on the other. It's a pretty devastating visual of the dire living conditions faced by people who were just completely locked out of the conventional economy. Moving from macroeconomics down to the micro-realities. Section 2. Faces in hard times. The human toll. This is the direct quote from a New York Times story in early 1932 that Zinn cites. It reads, "After vainly trying to get a stay of dispossession until January 15 from his apartment at 46 Hancock Street in Brooklyn, yesterday Peter J. Cornell, 48 years old, a former roofing contractor out of work and penniless, fell dead in the arms of his wife." I want us to just sit with that for a second. The sheer stress, the total human tragedy of eviction and poverty literally resulting in a man dropping dead in his wife's arms. It's just devastating. And then there's this visceral plea sent to Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia from a tenement dweller in East Harlem. The letter goes like this: "You know my condition is bad. I used to get pension from the government and they stopped. It is now nearly 7 months I am out of work. I have 4 children who are in need of clothes and food. My daughter, who is 8, is very ill and not recovering. My rent is due 2 months, and I'm afraid of being put out." This letter perfectly captures the suffocating desperation of urban tenement dwellers during this time period. Which brings us to Section 3, Grassroots Barter and Exchange, the Rise of Self-Help. When formal institutions failed, communities basically engineered their own survival. Take Seattle, for example. Their barter economy worked kind of like a giant puzzle. Step 1, the Fishermen's Union catches fish. Step 2, they exchange those fish with people who pick fruit and vegetables. Step 3, those goods are then swapped with folks who cut wood. And finally, Step 4, all of these goods are traded for professional services. Barbers, seamstresses, even doctors were trading their skills in return for food and firewood. Zinn notes that there were 22 local groups in Seattle alone, each running a commissary to make these trades happen. People literally just bypassed money entirely so their community could survive. And this ingenuity wasn't just an isolated thing. By the end of 1932, an astounding 330 self-help organizations existed across 37 states. 330. This really showcases the massive nationwide scale of this grassroots movement. It was this highly organized, incredibly spontaneous response to total systemic failure. And within those networks, there were over 300,000 members actively participating. Think about that. 300,000 Americans essentially stepped completely outside the traditional capitalist economy to trade their labor, their goods, and their services directly with their neighbors, just to stay alive.
Section 4. The Bootleg Coal Rebellion, Defying Property Lines.
Let's define what we actually mean here. Bootleg coal was coal dug from small mines situated directly on corporate company property. This was done by unemployed miners who would then load up trucks, drive the coal to the cities, and sell it well below commercial rates. The absolutely crucial point here is that these unemployed workers were taking radical, practical action. They were actively ignoring corporate property rights to dig up the fuel they desperately needed to survive and to provide affordable heating to cities that were freezing. The sheer scale of this operation was staggering. By 1934, 20,000 unemployed men had produced 5 million tons of bootleg coal, transporting it in 4,000 different vehicles. But honestly, what's truly astonishing is the community response. When the corporations actually tried to prosecute these men for stealing coal from private property, local juries simply would not convict them. And even if they somehow did, local jailers wouldn't imprison them. The entire local law enforcement and judicial system effectively protected the bootleggers because they recognized the practical, human necessity of what they were doing over the strict legality of property lines.
Section 5. The Power of Disruption, Limitations, and Takeaways.
These networks experienced a really rapid rise and fall. People started organizing them in 1931, and they peaked at those 330 organizations in 1932. But by early 1933, they had largely collapsed. You might be wondering why. Well, because these beautiful, community-driven barter systems were simply attempting way too big a job in an economy that was in complete shambles. You just can't fix a massive, national macroeconomic collapse purely through local bartering of fish and firewood. The problem was just too vast. This brings us to a major sociological theory that Zinn highlights in his text. He references writers Richard Cloward and Francis Piven, quoting them as saying, "Factory workers had their greatest influence and were able to exact their most substantial concessions from government during the Great Depression in the years before they were organized into unions. Their power during the Depression was not rooted in organization, but in disruption." Zinn points this out to suggest that labor actually won its greatest victories through spontaneous uprisings, like those miners defying property laws, rather than through formal organization. And that leaves us with a truly provocative question based on the historical evidence we've explored today. Does historical change, the kind that actually feeds starving people and fundamentally shifts power, come from formal organization and playing by the rules? Or does it come from spontaneous, grassroots disruption? It's a question the folks of the 1930s had to answer for themselves, and it's one that Zinn's history really asks us to ponder today. Think about that as you process the incredible resilience we've seen in this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and thanks so much for exploring with us today.